get some gin in there? Okay. Okay, well, so it's my happy duty to welcome everybody to this symposium, and it has special meaning for me because I came for the third summer program and took Intro to Epi and Intro to Biostats, and Moises was my professor in Epi, and Ellen Gold and Chuck Rohde taught. Yeah, so I could have done better, I think, but I remember. Coming, it was my first experience at Hopkins and thinking, what a wonderful place. It's such a sense of community and people were so supportive. And I remember we had lunch up in the second floor and you'd have speakers in the summer program and sitting down at a table with Moises, and next to him was George Comstock and Abe Lilienfeld, who I hadn't met at that point. And they were just so open and kind, and it was a great conversation. And then later I found out who they were, and was even more impressed. So for me, the school has always been associated. My sense of the school was really created toward it, during this summer institute, and it's also where I met Helen Abbey for the first time too, and Pepe, of course. And so I was surprised when I became dean at how much the symposium has grown and what it impacted. Obviously it had an impact on my career, but people come from all over the world for it. And so it's especially fitting, I think, that we celebrate this. I'm happy to just play a small part of it. And my job, I guess, is to introduce Moises Sklo, who needs no introduction, but Moises is professor of epidemiology, and he is editor of the American Journal of Epidemiology. And one of the other many things he does is to direct the Summer Institute. And Moises, we had the Society of Scholars earlier this year, but we had one of the scholars was from Italy who had been a student of Moises, and he started out by talking about the history of the department and the impact that Harold Kahn and Abe Lilienfeld, Leon Gordis, and Moises have had on epidemiology and the growth of academic epidemiology in Italy. And I'm sure we could have had people from 6 countries come and tell the same story. So Moises, please come up and start us off.
Thank you, Mike. Now, let me give you first of all, welcome everybody. It's so nice to see a lot of friends and colleagues today. I thought I would give you a short history of the Institute. Okay, so I think that would be nice. I mean, when the Institute was created, actually it was called the Summer Program of Epidemiology, when it was created founded in 1983. The A. Henderson was the dean. Edith Shunrich, who is still beautifully with us, was the senior associate dean, and Leon Gordis was the chairman of the department. And DA could not come, but he sent some recollections that I want to read for you. It's right there. You can read it yourself, but I'll facilitate. The course was precedent setting for the school because at the time, there were no classes whatsoever from commencement until early September. The parking lot at the back was all but empty. The decision to intrude on the hallowed summer months was not to be taken lightly. As it turned out, the course was eventually well and widely received and permitted many to begin to comprehend the importance of numerators and denominators, significance and chance, and both the meaning and importance of public health to the health of the public. And from that beginning, a growing menu of courses and initiatives emerged to fill the summer months. An 11-month MPH program emerged, part-time and extended degree programs began, and public health education at Hopkins served as pioneer. Now, in 1983, those are the courses that we offered. We offered 8 courses: Principles of Epi with Ellen Gold, Methods in Epidemiology, George Comstock, Occupational Epi with Gene Matanowski, Introduction to Biostatistics with Chuck Rohde, who is here somewhere, Epidemiology and Preventive Aspects of Cancer. Leon Gordis did that. I did the Cardiovascular Epidemiology course, and Kurt Miner did the Design and Conduct of Clinical Trials, and actually he did that for many years in sequence. Now we have approximately 40 courses. So as the school grows, so does the Summer Institute. We had a few seminars, 4, 5, uh, and you see the titles here. Now we have, I don't know, we offer, I lost track, but we offer something like 12 or more seminar presentations. And from the beginning, we have had a close collaboration with the Department of Biostatistics. And in fact, from 1999 on, the name of the program changed from Summer Program to Summer Institute of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. Now, since 1983, about 11,000 students attended Summer Institute courses. So sample size absolutely enormous. I hope the validity is also as good as precision here. If and famous alumni includes Mike and Larry Apple, who's sitting right there. So now it's interesting. I think the program has an incredible reach. Depending on the year, 50 to 70% of all the students have no Hopkins affiliation. In 1983, we had 110 students, and 10% were from outside, were foreign students. In 2011, we had about 500 students, about 1/3 from outside the United States. And we're very much part of the academic life of this school. In 2011, 223 students took the courses for academic credits, almost half of the students. Now, of these, 104 were school degree candidates. 84 were part-time MPH students. 119 students taking courses for credits registered as special student limited, meaning they probably had the intention of pursuing epidemiology, a degree in epidemiology, right? Now, in 1983, we had a few countries represented, but now we have about 40 countries. And Shoshana Balyu did a fantastic slide showing the evolution of our scope, the countries that we covered over the decades. So this is 1980s, this is 1990s, 2000, 2010. So it's incredible. I think virtually all continents are represented. We get students from all over the world. And we have several organizations have used the Institute as a resource, including WHO, PAHO, World Bank, several agencies in the United States. And finally, you know, I cannot start thinking about everyone that deserves to be thanked. I directed the Institute, but I'm a minor piece, and I think the credit should go to the faculty of the school and the staff. And so the faculty included those people, both the former deans and the present dean, former chairs, present chair of both biostatistics and epidemiology, Hopkins faculty, of course, in general, faculty from outside Hopkins. And when we started, the coordinators, the managers were Charlotte Lebauer and Steve Warm. And Joe McLaughlin, who is sitting right there, was also an important piece when we first started. And I want to acknowledge especially Helen Walters. Helen is sitting right there. Helen was an incredible help, and due to her vision, the program really expanded. And of course, Aisha Khan is following on Helen's footsteps. And also the faculty in epidemiology, administrators, Pat Case, Kelly Welch, Judy Thorne, Sheila Small, and the advisory board members that have helped us over the years. So that's what I had to tell you in the 5 minutes that were allocated to me. And I want to welcome the panelists and wish you a good discussion, good debate. Thank you.
Well, let me add my thanks to Moises and the staff. This is an extraordinary program. It really brings resources to the school. It brings us students, and it brings us opportunities to interact with other organizations, countries, etc. And we never would have been here today without Moises's leadership, so thank you, Moises. from the whole department. As you can see from your program, we have asked 5 speakers, some former affiliates of the department, some current faculty, to speak about where they see epidemiology going. And in order to see where it's going, we need to know where we've been. And so we gave them a very broad theme to talk from their perspective on where is this discipline and where is it going. We've asked them to keep their remarks relatively short. That certainly would be a challenge. Maybe I need a long stick or something. But if we could stay in the 10 to 12 minute range, that would be good. We're going to start out with Jiang He. He's the James Copes Chair and Professor of the Department of Epidemiology at Tulane University. He received his MD in Jiangxi Medical College, did a Doctor of Medical Science from Peking Union, which Hopkins had a strong affiliation with the development through Rockefeller Foundation, and his PhD is from our school, did his thesis in epidemiology. He's got wide-ranging research interests, but he has many NIH grants for studies of cardiovascular disease in China, and now most recently, I understand, in Argentina. So please welcome Dr. He.
Thank you, David, for a very generous introduction and invite me. Congratulations to Moses for this wonderful program. Really, in fact, a lot of people's career. I will give a talk on global burden of cardiovascular disease and risk factors. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death worldwide. According to World Health Organization, 30% of the total 58 million deaths worldwide in 2005 were due to cardiovascular disease. Despite a decrease in mortality, cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of death in high-income countries. With a decline in infant mortality and mortality from infectious disease and the increase in life expectancy, cardiovascular disease has become the leading cause of death in low and middle-income countries. This lifelong global burden disease project show cardiovascular disease account for 30% of total mortality. Traditional leading cause of death like infection disease, maternal and parental conditions, and nutrition deficiency only account for 30% mortality. Other chronic disease account for additional 31% mortality. Data from Global Burden of Disease Project also indicate ischemic heart disease, stroke, and cancer from upper respiratory system for the leading 3 cause of death in high-income countries. Ischemic heart disease, stroke, and low respiratory infections also were the leading cause of death, leading cause of death in low and middle-income countries. The rapid increase in chronic disease and the decrease in infectious disease were referred to epidemiological transition. There are several factors involved in epidemiological transition, including demographic changes such as urbanization and the aging of the population. Also, changes in risk factors include biological factors, environmental factors, social, cultural, and behavioral factors, and of course, clinical medical care. Epidemiology transition is happening in most low and middle income countries, especially in China, due to economic development, industrialization and urbanization, decrease in infant mortality and mortality from infectious disease, and the increase in life expectancy. The chronic disease, including cardiovascular disease, has become epidemic in China. Of course, the unhealthy diet include high calorie, high fat, high sodium diet, reduce physical activity, increase high cigarette smoking prevalence, and increased stress. Also contributed to chronic disease, especially cardiovascular disease, epidemic in China. This slide from 1957, which show respiratory disease, acute infection disease were the top two leading causes of death in China, followed by TB, digestive disease, heart disease. Heart disease, stroke, and cancer only account for 7, 6, and 5% of total mortality, respectively. We conduct a large cohort study in China, include over 107,000 representative sample in Chinese population, which show heart disease, cancer, and stroke account for more than 2/3 of total mortality in China. The leading 5 causes of death for Chinese men were cancer, heart disease, stroke, accident, and infection disease. For women were heart disease, stroke, cancer, pneumonia, and infection disease. The 5 leading causes of vascular disease were stroke, chronic pulmonary heart disease, coronary heart disease, heart failure, and rheumatic heart disease. The rapid increase in cardiovascular disease in the world, mainly due to the epidemic of major cardiovascular disease risk factors, include hypertension, dyslipidemia, diabetes, obesity, cigarette smoking, and physical inactivity in low and middle income countries. This slide from Global Burden of Disease project show high blood pressure, cigarette smoking, and high cholesterol were the 3 leading preventable global risk factors for total mortality. We estimate the total hypertension burden in the world. Our study show 26.6% of men and 26.1% of women in the world had hypertension in 2000, which represent about 1 billion population. The Global Burden of Disease project show 2.9 million stroke deaths, 3.3 million ischemic heart disease deaths, 0.7 million hypertensive disease deaths, and 0.6 million other cardiovascular disease deaths were due to increased blood pressure. Our study show in China alone 1.4 million deaths in men and 0.9 million deaths in women from cardiovascular disease were due to increased blood pressure. The majority of blood pressure related increased mortality from cardiovascular disease is due to stroke, 1.1 million in men and 0.8 million in women. Global burden disease project show about 4.8 million deaths in the world were due to cigarette smoking, about half in high-income countries and half in low and middle-income countries. They also show the mortality from cigarette smoking will be stable or slightly decreased in high-income countries. On the other hand, the mortality due to cigarette smoking will be increased in middle and low-income countries. Our study in China show about 538,000 men and 135,000 deaths in women were due to cigarette smoking. Another global public health problem is obesity. We estimate about 23.2% of world adult population in 2005 was overweight, represent about 937 million people. We also estimate that 9.8% of world adult population in 2005 were obese, which represent about 396 million people. The most important direct consequences of obesity epidemic is increase in diabetes risk. The International Federation of Diabetes report the age-adjusted prevalence of diabetes was about 9.8 in men and 9.2% in women in 2008, up from 8.3% and 7.5% in 1980. The number of people with diabetes increased from 153 million in 1980 to 347 million in 2008. In addition to about 1 million deaths directly assigned to diabetes, 1.5 million from coronary heart disease and 0.7 million from stroke were attributed to high glucose, which accounted for about 21% and 13% of all deaths from those conditions. In addition, 1.8 million of those 2.2 million cardiovascular disease deaths were in low and middle income countries. We did a large national study in China to estimate the prevalence of diabetes. Our study showed 10.6% of men and 8.8% of women in China had diabetes. In addition, 16.1% men and 15% women had pre-diabetes in China in 2008, which represent about 9.4 million diabetes cases and 148 million pre-diabetes cases in Chinese population. With the epidemic of diabetes in China, we can see the cardiovascular disease and the kidney disease mortality will be increased in very near future. So in conclusion, chronic disease, including cardiovascular disease, are the leading cause of death in the world. Cardiovascular disease risk factors include high blood pressure, cigarette smoking, obesity, and diabetes pose an important global public health burden. Without the effective intervention, chronic disease will continue to increase, especially in low and middle income countries. Control of modifiable risk factors for chronic disease should be a global public health priority. Thank you for your attention.
So, as you listen to these speakers, think about past, present, future. And we're going to have everyone come up after all the presentations. Next is Alfredo Morabia. He came to us in the mid-1980s following completing his internal medicine boards in Switzerland. He received a PhD from Epi in 1989 and an MHS in biostatistics. So another double hitter. He returned to Switzerland, where he served as professor and head of the division of clinical epi at the University Hospitals of Geneva from 1990 to 2006. When he moved to New York, joined the faculty at CUNY and at the Mailman School. And as you're going to learn shortly, he has focused more recently on the history of epidemiology. And I think with the idea that the past can give us a lot of hints about where we're going in the future. So, Alfredo.
Thank you, David. Just a second. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, David. Thank you, Moses. And frankly, I see a lot of familiar faces, even though it was a long time ago I was here. And even though the place looks physically different, it feels the same. And the department has not changed. It remained extremely challenging for its members and its guests, because here I am, granted 15 minutes. At the origin, in the email, now down to 12 minutes, to talk to you about the past, the present, and the future of epidemiology.
3 extra minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. But please do me a favor. Can you put on your seatbelt? Because we're going to cover 350 years at an average speed of probably 25 years per minute. So Okay, so I think one way of rewording the question is that is there a single, simple idea that can thread together the past and the present of epidemiology and can allow us to predict and say something about its future? So I propose the following idea. It works easier. That the emergence, evolution, and refinement of epidemiologic methods and concepts appear to be motivated by challenging health problems in public health or in medicine, often associated with major changes in society. I'd like to show you that with some example across the century from public health, from medicine, and if you agree with me, we could talk about the future. So let's look at the past. And you know, the oldest past for epidemiology is the 17th century, 1650. Before that, there is no epidemiology. And by then, that was the 17th century, a very difficult century with lots of crises, economical, political, and social. And a major health concern then was the plague. And the plague had been in Europe since the 14th century. It was bubonic plague, but it was recurrent, and in the 17th century it was a real obstacle for the existence even of the state. It was paralyzing society. And as you can see here in this broadsheet from the 17th century, when the plague was around, people were escaping London by boat or on land. So the city was emptied. Most of the civil servants were away. The parliament didn't meet. So the entire city and the state was paralyzed. And the King of England had asked the church, which was one of its state institution, to actually centralize and publish the data from its parishes about the death, and in particular the death from plague. And those were the bills of mortality. And actually our first pioneer of epidemiology, John Grant, seized that chance and actually tabulated this data and tried to see whether he could say something about the plague that could be useful. And even though he didn't use R, he just used table, but by then it was just as revolutionary as R is today. What he found was extremely surprising. Not so much the way the plague behaved with like shark thieves, you know, very, because these people could expect, but it was the contrast, because here you had the total number of deaths and the total births, and the regularity of events in population was something unknown before that. And the contrast with the plague led him to say that it was most likely an environmental factor that came in and out of London, and that may have helped, you know, to control the plague. By the end of the century, 17th century, the plague had quasi disappeared, and maybe that, Grant's book was a bestseller, and maybe has contributed to that. And let's move to the following century. The 18th century was a much more prosperous century. Plague was away, but smallpox was still there. And even though smallpox was had a lower mortality than plague, it killed at the head of the states. It killed the queens and the princes and the kings. And here you see Balthazar Carlos, who should have become king of Spain. And you have here Louis XV, who was king of France, and Mary of England. Many kings and queens and princesses died of smallpox. And so it was a very important issue of the 18th century. And our pioneering ancestor, here you have John Arbuthnot and James Durin and Thomas Nettleton. They tried to see whether inoculation could be a solution. And because inoculation was available, it could be help to prevent smallpox. But the question was, did it kill less or not than the natural smallpox. And they look at the bills of mortality. They found that smallpox killed about 10% of the people. And then they collected data from inoculators, and they found that actually artificial smallpox killed only 1%. And so there was a 10-time reduction in risk. Benjamin Franklin had been convinced, and probably also George Washington, since before Jenner, he got the Continental Army inoculated. So that was for the 18th century. Before we leave that century, we need to go and shake the hand of James Lind, because he was also from that century. But I won't tell you his story again about how, he tested the treatment of scurvy. I just wanted to show you, if you didn't know it, the type of boat in which he did his experiment. So let's move now to the 19th century. Another terrible century, at least started in a big chaos, industrial revolution, large cities, concentration of people, very low level of hygiene. And in the middle of this real chaos and misery, here comes, knocking at the doors of Europe and America, a new scourge, and it was cholera. A terrible disease, that killed people in a few hours and left them like desiccated corpse with an entire blue skin. And the sanitarian, they thought that it was due to air pollution. And in order to prove that it was not due to air pollution, here again, I'm telling you something that you know very well, but it's a milestone. John Snow had to come out with a new design, something that no one had done before, that he could compare people who were just exposed to the same type of air pollution, but differed by their exposure to water. As you know well, he compared those people living in exactly the same neighborhoods, but some drank polluted water and others not, and he showed that the risk was higher among those who get polluted water. So that was the public health example of the 19th century. There's a very important medical example, because the 19th century is also the appearance of very large hospitals. And those hospitals concentrate hundreds of patients. And so there were an opportunity for our ancestor to start to assess the efficacy of treatment. And that's what Pierre-Louis did with bloodletting, or also assess, the complication and the consequences of medical practice. And that's what Semmelweis did, when he showed that combining anatomopathological teaching and the bedside teaching, could create epidemics of puerperal fever. So that was for the 19th century and their main issues and how epidemiologists improved their methods. And let's move to 1900. That's a more prosperous period again. Most of the scourges of the past are gone, but there is still one that is problematic for people in public health. Tuberculosis remains very prevalent, remains a major killer, but especially it looks very different than it used to look. This was how it consumed people in the early 19th century, and this is how people could live with tuberculosis, have children and family, etc. And so in this atmosphere that was really dominated by eugenics and racial hygiene, pre-Nazi racial hygiene, very different stuff, in Germany, they were wondering, well, if the tuberculosis can live longer, are we all going to be once tuberculous and the whole human species is going to disappear? And the one who addressed this question was Weinberg in Germany. You know him because he's the Weinberg of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. But here is Weinberg as an epidemiologist. And in order to show that the people with tuberculosis lived, longer or shorter lives than those without, he couldn't do cross-sectional study. He couldn't use any of the design that were available before. So he invented a new design, which was a cohort study based on registry, but huge cohort study in which he followed up to age 20 thousands of children, some born of parents with tuberculosis and some with not. And he showed that tuberculosis was not an issue for the survival of the race, because they died earlier and had less children. And indeed, tuberculosis from 1900 to 1940 was declining. But there was another disease that was rising, and this was cancer. And this was the medical example, because cancer was something new, relatively rare. And where would you find cancer? In hospitals, in medical practices. And how would you study cancer? Well, the logical way that had to be invented then was to take those cases, concentrate in hospital and hospital practices and medical practice, and take people without the disease and compare them with respect to past exposure. And that's what Janet Lane Clapon did with the first case control study that we can really consider as such in 1926. Was a breast cancer case control study where she found most of what we know today about the reproductive factors associated with breast cancer. And there were other cancer case control studies, like Herbert Lumber published in New England Journal of Medicine in 1928 from Massachusetts data, or Percy Stocksey in England. But there was another disease which also interested and preoccupied doctors more than public health, and this was ischemic heart disease. And if you see here, Dr. Hayes shows you the situation today, but it really started around 1900. I mean, it could be also a problem of identifying the disease, but after 1940, it's pretty sure that this is what happened. Before that, it's quite extrapolated. But it was a new disease that doctors were seeing in 1920s and 30s. And same thing as cancer. They started to do the first case control studies. And they looked at tobacco very early. And this one is 1929 in JAMA, and 1937 in JAMA, and 1940 in JAMA, all case control studies of cardiovascular disease. So this brings us to the second part of the 20th century. And at that time, one thing that had become very clear is that there was a huge epidemic ongoing, and this was an incredible success of tobacco and cigarette smoking. You see cigarette sales in the US across the century. I mean, a huge success, huge rise, followed by the trends in lung cancer that you know pretty well. And this became, the topic of main interest in public health after 1945. And as you know, also, that was the occasion to improve the case control study design, improve the cohort studies for cancer, but also for cardiovascular disease. And you know those names. And so this was for the public health, but there's also very important changes at the medical level after 1945, extremely important, which attracted the attention of epidemiologists. First of all, treatment. Unprecedented number of pharmaceutical drugs, of hormones for contraception in particular, and other vaccines. They needed to be evaluated for the side effect, but also for the efficacy. And they lead, it's been a long process that Cochrane, led. It started quite early, but it led to the Cochrane collaboration. And the other thing which was led in this school was the issue of screening. An unprecedented number of technical, instruments that you could use at the mass level to screen for disease. And they needed to be evaluated, and that's when we started to evaluate screening with randomized trial, and this is the famous, HIP randomized trial. So the people who did all that, you know them. They are probably, for those of my generation, I don't know about the other, those are all familiar faces, and Lilienfeld, and Morris, and Susser, and Winder, and Breslow, who just died, and Dahl, and Cornfield. Those were the classic epidemiologists. They did all these studies and these developments. And I think that today, we go to present now, and I hope I'm still in the time. We have modern epidemiology, but I think essentially here you have, the general textbook and specialized textbook, many specialized textbooks. I think in the essence, they're elaborated, they have a theory of design, of disease occurrence, of confounding interaction and everything. But essentially, they remain classic approaches in the sense that the objective is to identify the one single cause that may explain most of the disease occurrence and on which we could act to try to reduce that. I think that's what characterizes modern epidemiology. It's still part of the classic epidemiology and all the work that has been done on cancer and cardiovascular disease. So let me see if my hypothesis has been, kind of illustrated. I said the emergent evolution and refinement of epidemiologic methods and concepts appear to be motivated by challenging health problems in public health, medicine, often associated with major change in society. So plague, smallpox, cholera, cancer, cardiovascular disease. So if this is true, it tells us where we have to look to know where the future is. And in order to know where the future is, we have to know where the health of the public is going. And that's where this is probably what is going to stimulate the further developments of epidemiology. And I think, as Dr. Hay has shown very nicely before, I mean, the main issue now are kind of, I don't know how to call them exactly, but complex traits fit well in the sense that they don't have a single cause. They cannot be modified or changed by a single intervention. They are quite complex. They are metabolic. They are neurodegenerative and psychiatric, infectious diseases, aging. All these factors need different approaches. And we know that people are looking around to find these approaches, much more multidisciplinary approaches, separation of explanation, which allows for a lot of complexity, and intervention, which needs to be reductionist and focus on specific issues, life course analysis, causal models, global monitoring and surveillance. All this tends to shift the place of epidemiology in science. I think epidemiology has always been kind of central in the scientific networks, but I think now more than ever, epidemiologists are finding themselves in the center of, fonts of huge amount of data, but also huge amount of works in other disciplines. And this is what requires new skills, and I think schools of public health need to prepare themselves to address those issues and train their students in order for them to be able to play this type of role that is expecting from them. And when you think of the role of the situation of genetic epidemiology today and the role epidemiologists play in those networks, I think it talks about where the future is going. So I think I see the future with changes in the training. But there's one point, David, which I'd like to mention that should be part of the training of the future epidemiologists. And this is history. Don't forget that our past is a fabulous trove to search for answers about our future. I mean, when you have questions about the future, wonder whether there are no answers already in the past. Because the past, our history, and you'll soon see it because the thing is slow, is a huge domain. You can ask a lot of questions, and you can wonder why some groups succeeded and why others failed, and how people react in the past to the change of societies and change of the health of the public. And I think this can inform us about how to do better in the future. And thank you. Thank you. That was quite a few slides. Next up is Bill Moss. Bill is a pediatrician. He has subspecialty training in infectious disease. He has worked in Africa for many years, principally Ethiopia, Zambia, South Africa, Kenya. Must be a few more. You can fill them in. Issues of childhood measles, malaria, infections. He's done a great gamut of work.
He's an associate professor in the department, and we're really pleased to have him here with us today. So I'll give you over to Bill Moss.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me. I share Dr. Morabia's trepidation in trying to cover the past, present, and future of infectious disease epidemiology in 10 minutes or so, particularly given the fact that, as you've seen already, that epidemiology really has its roots in infectious disease epidemiology. But given this longevity, rumors of the demise of infectious disease epidemiology are greatly exaggerated. And the real point of my talk is to convince you that it's actually a very exciting time to be doing infectious disease epidemiology, and the future looks very bright. So I needed an organizing principle for this short talk, and I took the title, borrowed or modified the title of a classic set of papers by Mervyn and Ezra Susser in 1996 on choosing the future of epidemiology. And I'm going to use that as a framework and guiding theme for describing what I see as the future of infectious disease epidemiology. And I'll talk on about some of the issues that Dr. Morabia put in a wider context. But the Sussers talk about errors and paradigms in epidemiology and break the history of epidemiology up into three kind of broad eras, each with a dominant paradigm, borrowing that term from Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. So they start off with sanitary statistics and a pervading paradigm of miasma, then infectious disease epidemiology and germ theory, followed by chronic disease epidemiology and what they call, I don't think pejoratively, but we can discuss about this, black box epidemiology. So let me briefly go through these and then talk about the future that they propose and see how infectious disease epidemiology fits in this. So just very briefly, as Dr. Morabia mentioned, sanitary statistics was kind of one of the initial public health movements that drew on epidemiology and from which the field of epidemiology developed. Their guiding theory was one of miasma, where diseases were really acquired through emanations from water or soil or from the air. Our term malaria, which means bad air from the Latin, is really paradigmatic of this movement, and this movement accomplished a lot. The key players included Edwin Chadwick and Florence Nightingale, and they really did a lot for public health, but they were guided by the wrong biological theory. Then came germ theory as the paradigm, as Dr. Morabia mentioned, led in part by the work of John Snow, really showing that cholera was transmitted in the water. It was a couple decades later when Louis Pasteur showed the first disease due to a microorganism, however, in silkworm, and then Robert Koch identified a number of bacterial pathogens, including the bacterial pathogens of anthrax, leprosy, and tuberculosis as human disease. And this was really dominated by what we know as Koch's postulates or Henle-Koch postulates, in which a single etiologic agent was associated with a single disease. And this era went up through the mid-20th century, and then followed by what the Sussers called black box epidemiology, which was really kind of the classic epidemiology trying to understand associations between exposures and outcomes without needing to understand really the mechanisms that linked the exposure and the outcome. And perhaps the classic example here is the association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. So during this time of kind of this paradigm of chronic disease or era of chronic disease epidemiology, there was a sense that infectious diseases, at least in the Western world, were going away, and were not, and that in the field of infectious disease epidemiology was really going to come to an end. There are a number of famous quotes of people claiming the demise of infectious diseases. William Stewart, the Surgeon General in the 1960s. This is one from McFarland Burnett, who was a giant in virology and immunology, won the Nobel Prize, really saying that we're really perhaps coming to an end of infectious diseases at the, toward the end of the 20th century. Now, what the Sussers put forth in a subsequent paper as kind of a future of epidemiology is something they called eco-epidemiology, with eco referring to ecology, and they used this paradigm of Chinese boxes. And what they really wanted to point out that was that epidemiologists needed to look at the molecular level, at causes of disease, and at the societal and social level. And I think epidemiology has really gone along this path in trying to look more broadly at causal factors and etiologies, and using molecular tools as well as the tools of social sciences to look more broadly. So this is just a kind of a figure that I somewhat adapted from the Institute of Medicine, called The Future of Public Health in the 21st Century, that really lays out this hierarchy or layers for which epidemiologists need to focus. And from the point of view of infectious disease epidemiology, that includes looking at the molecular and genetic characteristics of microorganisms. Now, what the Sussers saw as driving this need for a shift in how epidemiologists think and approach their project were twofold. One were transformations in global health patterns. They were particularly influenced by the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and also advances in biomedical technology and informatics that they saw coming down the pathway. And I'm going to use these two themes to show you kind of where we are and where I think we're going in infectious disease epidemiology, and then come to some what I think are some unifying and novel conceptual frameworks as we move forward. So certainly there have been great transformations in global health patterns in infectious disease epidemiology. These include both the recognition of the emergence of new infectious diseases and their very rapid global spread. So this is a figure from a paper published in Nature on global trends in emerging infectious diseases, where they mapped emerging infectious diseases events from 1940 to 2004 globally. You can see different types of pathogens. And this kind of work really requires the establishment of large-scale global surveillance systems that can detect these events in real time. And then we all know many examples of how these emerging infectious diseases can then spread very rapidly. This is a very classic figure from the CDC for the SARS coronavirus, spreading from Hotel M in Hong Kong, an international hotel, spreading internationally into other hospitals and healthcare facilities within Hong Kong. So this certainly establishes the need, I think, for the future of infectious disease epidemiology. I think it was unrecognized in the 1960s how frequently emergent events were of new infectious diseases. Now, I also think that going forward, that infectious disease epidemiology is going to be driven by new technologies. And I just want to talk about some of these, how we measure contact patterns and networks through which infectious diseases spread, how we can use spatial patterns and remote sensing to look at, to really identify spatial risk factors for infectious diseases, and how we can use the genomics, and particularly genomic information from the organism and genomic information from the host to understand distributions of infectious diseases. So I'm just going to give some examples of this. On the top panel here, I have some diagrams of classic either social networks from Warwick University or sexual networks from the Colorado Springs study. But new technologies are really enabling us to really get a good handle on human contact patterns that can influence infectious disease spread. People are using mobile phone technology and information. This is a recent study done by a group from Stanford of high school students, where they used what are called motes, or electronic devices that the students and teachers would wear around their neck, and it would trigger or record anytime two people wearing a mote were within 3 meters, and it would record the frequency of these contacts and the duration of these contacts. And this kind of information allows them to generate very dense contact networks, and then they can model on these networks various interventions to say control influenza spread and influenza virus spread in schools. So one example of how technology is really providing the information, detailed information at high resolution to understand infectious disease spread. This is an example from my own work using satellite imagery and remote sensing to generate a risk map for malaria transmission in southern Zambia. So we purchase a high-resolution satellite image. We can identify all the households. Those are kind of those brown dots. We can then use that to establish a sampling frame and randomly select households. And then we can use remote sensing to characterize ecological aspects of the landscape in order to generate what's shown here, a risk map, areas where there's a high risk of malaria transmission that are likely near breeding sites. So another example of how technology is really moving infectious disease epidemiology forward. Another, as I mentioned before, are the availability of genome sequencing of pathogens. And this is a complex example. I don't have time to go into detail, but this is an outbreak of tuberculosis in British Columbia, Canada, where on the left-hand panel is a transmission network that's generated by traditional genotyping of Mycobacterium tuberculosis using tandem repeats and social network analysis, which made it look like there was one outbreak and one kind of individual at the center of that outbreak, but they then did whole genome sequencing. So got very high resolution genome sequencing and showed that it was actually two outbreaks that were occurring simultaneously, and were able to get a much better picture of the network of transmission. And then lastly, we're moving forward, obviously, in the techniques and the lower cost to do widespread genome-wide association studies of human genes that influence susceptibility to infectious diseases. And we're going to find more and more markers of genetic susceptibility of infectious diseases. So I want to move next to some unifying and novel conceptual frameworks in infectious disease epidemiology as the way of the future. First, we're learning more and more about how pathogens influence traditionally what we are thought of as chronic diseases. There are many examples of this. This is just a partial list from an Institute of Medicine report. Obviously, classic ones like hepatitis B virus and human papillomavirus, but more recently, associations between, say, herpes simplex virus and schizophrenia, or chlamydia pneumoniae and atherosclerosis. And so I think we're going to find more and more examples of how traditional infectious diseases cause chronic diseases. Perhaps more recently has been an understanding of the human microbiome. And the NIH is funding a human microbiome project, which is attempting to identify the vast array of bacteria that are found in humans. It's a striking fact that bacterial cells in our own bodies outnumber our own cells 10 to 1. So as you look around you, you're looking primarily at the bacteria next to you rather than individuals. But a lot is being learned about this microbiome, its diversity, but also the critical role this microbiome plays in human disease, human health and disease. Many of these are beneficial bacteria. And so I think this notion of infectious diseases, kind of an us versus them, simple conceptual framework is changing. There's been great strides in developing more and more sophisticated dynamic models of infectious disease. This is a diagram of a relatively simple dynamic model based on a compartmental model of susceptible, infected, recovered individuals that one can then graph dynamics over time and use those models to address a number of different questions, explain observed patterns, predict future trends, study control measures. And these models are getting more and more sophisticated. There are agent-based models and more accepted in infectious disease epidemiology as a way to explore infectious disease dynamics. And then lastly, as a unifying framework for all this, and kind of coming back perhaps to the eco-epidemiology proposed by the Sussers two decades ago, is this notion of phylogeodynamics that really links what's happening at the molecular level, the immunologic level in the human host, transmission patterns, epidemic dynamics to large-scale spatial structures, and then global phylogeny. And so this is a newer notion that's kind of a nascent notion in infectious disease epidemiology that's really trying to bridge all these different levels. I just want to end with some comments on training in infectious disease epidemiology. I see training going forward having to incorporate these different levels that I've talked about. I just want to use as an example this recent paper on how to make epidemiological training infectious, and that has a couple meanings, but one is this group kind of compares and contrasts classical epidemiology with dynamical epidemiology and says and makes the claim that infectious disease epidemiologists going forward need to have concepts and methods from both toolboxes. I think another important point, this is based on a course that's offered at the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, and Dr. Sklo mentioned earlier the international component of the Summer Institute, and I think more and more our role going forward is going to be training endemic country scientists to conduct this work. So I'll stop there.
So far, I haven't tripped. There's still another opportunity or two. Next up is Elizabeth Platts. Elizabeth is a professor in the Department of Epi. She is the head of the Cancer Epi training concentration and the T32 training grant. She's the Martin Abeloff Scholar in Cancer Prevention. She has about 12 additional titles, which makes me happy. She is really our leader in the cancer epi area. She studies prostate and colon cancer. She's moving into translational research, and we're going to hear her perspective.
Okay, terrific. So thank you, and this is a wonderful day. Now, my voice is not perfect today, and I will show you why in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about our history, about our present time, and then moving forward. And thank you to Alfredo for setting the stage for this. So past successes. So we've already heard about smoking as a cause of lung cancer, and it was epidemiology that contributed heavily to this. Of course, we need basic science, laboratory science, to help bring the story together. But certainly, the original case control studies and then the British doctor study really helped to bring this as a cause to the table. HPV as a cause of cervical cancer. Epi studies were pivotal in establishing that relationship. Okay, so why were we able to identify these associations using the cancer epi approach? Well, first of all, we need to recognize that some of these early associations did have large magnitude of risk. Okay, so they were easier to pick out from background. And also for both of these diseases, lung cancer and cervical cancer, they were primarily a single common major exposure. So again, easier to pick out. But as we've moved forward in time, where we have sort of less common exposures, less common diseases, it's a little more difficult to be able to pick out associations in a consistent way. One thing that's really lovely about our past successes is that observation led to action. And so we had the ability to intervene. And in intervening, we were able to make a difference in cancer mortality. So certainly the Surgeon General's report, people quit smoking starting in the mid-1960s. Other people did not start smoking. And now we can see a tremendous decline, because remember we have this latency to think about, tremendous decline in lung cancer mortality in the current era in men. In women, we have a little bit of a delay because women started smoking a little later than men in the last century. So for cervical cancer, early detection of pre-cervical neoplasia and their treatment led to a remarkable decline in cervical cancer mortality in the U.S. And so if you take a look at this image from the American Cancer Society's Cancer Facts and Figures, you can see that they've labeled it as uterine cancer, and that's because at the turn of the last century, we weren't able to separate cervical cancer from the body of the uterus, and so it's all combined. But this decline is primarily due to the reduction in cervical cancer mortality. Okay, some more recent successes in the field of cancer epidemiology. The identification of aspirin in the prevention of many cancers, including colorectal cancer and its precursor adenomas. So a number of studies. So early on, Lynn Rosenberg up at BU and her drug epi unit showed that there is a inverse association between aspirin and colorectal cancer. Many subsequent studies, trials, and so on to document for colorectal cancer. Obesity and inactivity. So cancer epi have helped to establish these as causes of cancer. And so you might be familiar with work done by the American Cancer Society, Jean Cal, that looked at a number of different cancer outcomes. So, you name it, if you can study it, she looked at it. And certainly strong associations for some cancers, a little weaker for others, but overall a consistent relationship. Okay, so now let's talk about translation of those findings. So for aspirin, we're actually not ready to translate. Okay, so we don't feel that it's the moment. There were a couple of systematic reviews that the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force had groups conduct, and while they found that there is a protective association, the problem for aspirin is that it does have GI effects and also risk of bleed in the brain. And so at this time, the recommendation is not to use aspirin and other NSAIDs for the prevention of colorectal cancer. Translation into public health guidelines. Certainly for obesity, a number of groups have recommendations, both public health guidelines for obesity and also individual recommendations. And so here's one example from the World Cancer Research Fund, American Institute for Cancer Research. And I don't know if you can see this, public health goals. Okay, so here's where we need to keep our body mass index as a population between 21 and 23. Raise your hand if you're between 21 and 23. Okay, well, so this is a pretty tough goal, and this is why I knock myself out on a regular basis to try to keep my weight down. This is yesterday. This is why my voice is a disaster. I went to an adventure park and yelled and screamed the whole time, so it was actually really fun. So yeah, allergies and yelling and screaming together. Okay, so anyway, so here's some of the problems we've had in cancer epi over the past 30 years and even through today. So when we took our observational data and moved into trials, we didn't always find what we expected to find based on the observational data. And a classic example is the story of beta-carotene in lung cancer. So ample epi evidence, observational epi evidence, that eating fruits and vegetables rich in beta-carotene associated with reduced risk of lung cancer. When the field moved to testing this hypothesis in trial settings, no association. In fact, in 2 of the 3 trials, there seemed to be an increased risk of lung cancer in the people who are randomized to the beta-carotene supplement. So in retrospect, what happened? Did we misunderstand, or maybe even ignore some of the subtleties of observational data? And I think that's probably very true. And we didn't think so much about the idea that more is not necessarily better in a replete population. Okay, so maybe deficient individuals could benefit from supplementation to reduce cancer risk, but those who are already in the replete range, more may not be better. In fact, more might be harmful. And we may not have thought in great detail about dose and timing. So is exposure to extra nutrients in adulthood the way to go, or do we have to make sure that we're replete throughout the life course? And also the formulation. Does it make sense to deliver a particular single isomer of a nutrient, or do we need to have an array of that type of isomer, or do we need to have the complex array of all nutrients in foods as usually consumed? But on the bright side, we've been very efficient in using the trial data, so cancer chemoprevention trials and also cancer screening trials. We've turned them into cancer epi cohorts, and now we've been able to do lots and lots of research. And when I say we, I mean the field has been able to do lots and lots of research using these resources. And here's a little bit more of negative news that I think we need to move past. So sometimes we've gotten stuck in a cancer epi rut. So we've only been moving the field along in little teeny tiny increments at times. And this is because we kind of went down this path of the nutrient of the day or the SNP of the day. And we haven't really progressed as fast as I think we should have. And then we've gotten to the point where results are not really consistent from study to study, and we haven't really made a systematic attempt to reconcile findings among studies. And this often leads to message confusion for the lay public. So today you hear one thing about something being a risk factor for cancer, tomorrow it's a different story, or it's a contradictory story. And then we've had the problem of Me Too science. Big problem in cancer epi. We revisit the same exposure-disease relationship over and over, but not in a way to progress the field, but literally just studying the same thing in the same way. So we haven't improved our exposure measurement or study design or thought about ways to reduce bias. So we have not always moved forward with our understanding. So on the bright side, we've come up with new ways of coming together, bringing cancer epidemiologists together, pooling our resources, pooling our cohorts to be able to study, to get results that are going to be consistent, that are stable, coming to a consensus much faster, being able to look within subgroups. So big science pooling efforts. Now, of course, the problem with these efforts is they're usually underfunded. So each cohort isn't necessarily receiving the full support that they need. And also we have the problem of multiple, when I say multiple, I mean hundreds of authors in some cases. Okay, another bright side, we've now developed national and international cancer cohorts that have greater racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and geographic diversity. Oh, I should have mentioned for big science, we do play a role in the cohort consortium, which is supported by the National Cancer Institute. So the Clue 1, Clue 2, so Dr. Comstock's big efforts are now a component of the cohort consortium, and Kala Visvanathan in our department leads that component. And then Eric, so a cardiovascular cohort, will now be joining the Cancer Epi Cohort Consortium as a member. And Joe asked us to figure out, can we like somehow add on to the Eric logo? And he said, how about Erica for cancer? So that's not official, but I thought he might think that's cute. Okay. So more recently, past 5-10 years now, so narrowing the time frame, still a little bit of history, the field has been able to establish productive multidisciplinary collaborations in the area of cancer etiology, prevention, and control. And this is with cancer biologists, oncologists, other physicians who are involved in cancer treatment, pathology. We've learned each other's language and culture. This is very important to be able to collaborate, to know each other's language and culture. And we've all been able to develop mutual respect for each other's disciplines. So very important for being able to move forward and also to train students. So to be able to train students to be involved in multidisciplinary research, we need to be able to convey that we do in fact respect each other's disciplines. And as you've heard several other speakers mention, life course epi. So cancer epidemiologists have embraced this approach as well. In the past, we tended to study middle-aged people. Those were the people who participated in our cohorts. That was within the time frame of our investigators, but we may have missed important etiologically relevant windows of time. Okay, past 5 to 10 years, somewhat of a negative, I would say. We entered this era of high throughput research, so for measurement, so GWAS and proteomics and epigenetics. So in theory, great, but the way we approached it didn't really pan out, I don't think. So these were very expensive approaches. There was this jump on the bandwagon phenomenon that occurred. So every time I showed up at a study section, everybody was trying to do this, right? They weren't even thinking about how they were going to do it. It just sounded good. But it was really expensive. It was agnostic, not hypothesis driven. And in general, these approaches just haven't panned out. So in my specific cancer area, prostate cancer, the SNPs that have been found, maybe they're up to about 50. The relative risks are just vanishingly small. Expensive, tiny relative risks. Not sure how they're going to make a difference in the end. Okay, but I should tell you that the traditional epi approach, case control studies, actually does still help us advance our knowledge about the causes of cancer. I want to highlight an example. So here's Amber D'Souza sitting right there. So this was part of her thesis work, and it could be claimed both by the infectious disease area of concentration where she was as a student, and then she's been a faculty member in the cancer epi area of concentration now for several years. So we're going to claim it too. And so a case control study documenting the role of HPV in a subset of head and neck cancers. Okay, so today and into the future. So first message, ask important, underline important, cancer-related questions. So I don't know how many of you saw this letter in Science a few weeks ago. Has anyone seen this one? No? Type 3 error. Does anyone know what type 3 error is? Ganji.
Asking the wrong question.
Yeah, so it's getting the right answer, but to the wrong question. In cancer epi for a while, I think we kind of went down that path, right? We don't want to do that anymore. We want to make sure we're asking important questions and then getting the right answer to those important questions. And we also want to teach our students to think this way, okay? So not just sort of, I don't even mean just filling in gaps, but really asking important big picture questions. So this is interesting if you want to take a look at this letter. Okay, and then I think we actually have an obligation as a field to move into translational cancer epidemiology. We have to figure out how to make a difference. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to do etiologic research, meaning that sort of, is this associated with that, if it's foundational, if down the road it might have potential to actually make a difference. We just need to avoid the Me Too science approach at this point. To be able to be translational cancer epidemiologists, we have to think about reaching out to other disciplines beyond our basic and traditional sort of oncology colleagues. So we have to learn how to collaborate with health services researchers, internal medicine physicians, health insurance providers, and health economists. And we have to bring our thinking, that is the epi thinking, the design measurement, into quality improvement research, including research using claims data. And so there are lots of examples that I can think about, but I have this little note at the bottom, gulp, denominators, temporality and huge data sizes to be dealt with claims data. We don't always know what the right denominator is for those types of data. So we're going to have to think very carefully and do this together for cancer. We also have to learn to collaborate with interventionists to test the benefits of cancer epi discoveries, meaning consensus-supported discoveries. What we tend to do as cancer epidemiologists is we put our findings out there into the public domain, and then we say, what's the next question we can ask? We don't actually help to move the findings to the point of implementation and testing that implementation. So I think we have to learn how to collaborate with the interventionists more. We also have to learn how to collaborate with engineers and physical scientists. Okay, language is very different across disciplines. So to be able to sit down and actually hold a conversation to figure out how together we can make a difference is very important. So for engineers and physical scientists, we can talk with them about how to measure exposure and even outcome. So sort of nanoscale measurement, imaging, thinking about maybe how to optimally detect circulating tumor cells. And we also need their help with efficiency of information management and analysis. And again, it's going to come down to making sure we can share language and be able to communicate. And just to show you that people do reach out from other disciplines. So I was just asked a few weeks ago to give a talk in the Center of Cancer Nanotechnology Excellence here at the university. And they actually said, next year, can you ask your students in cancer epidemiology to participate in their poster session, because then the students can start talking. Right, so they wanted to understand what is cancer epidemiology. They wanted to understand where cancer data come from so that we can start working together. Okay, so other important areas we need to think about. So conducting cancer epi research on prevention and prognostication for patients who already have cancer and cancer survivors. So in the past we tended to focus on true risk and true prevention, meaning you start with people who don't have cancer and you follow them forward in time for the identification of risk factors for cancer. But now we have large populations of individuals with cancer and even larger populations of cancer survivors. We have to start really focusing on research to identify modifiable factors to reduce risk of poor outcome in those individuals. And just to highlight Corey Joshu, who has been doing research in that area, in particular in men with prostate cancer, looking at recurrence. And one of the exposures she studied was obesity and weight gain. And subsequent to that, there was a Institute of Medicine workshop to understand the role of obesity in cancer outcomes, and her work was highlighted in that workshop. And another area that's really important is biospecimen-based prognostic factors. This type of research was always in the purview of basic and clinical scientists. Epidemiologists were kind of doing their own thing on the side, but we need to do it together. Make sure we bring epi study design and epi thinking into that kind of research. And I can tell you it's very interesting to watch my colleagues across the street as they transition in their thinking about how to study biomarkers. So traditionally they had cases and controls, but cases where their patients and controls were people whose stuff they just got from over here. Okay, so it wasn't prospective and it wasn't well characterized. But now they realize, wait a minute, they want to use samples, if you're trying to do like screening type work, samples from before the diagnosis to see if you can predict. And for prognostication, you don't want to go digging around and see what you have in your repository. You want clear sets of cohorts that can be studied. Okay, so translational cancer epi and the concept of integrative prevention. So I've been talking about cancer, but gosh, some of the risk factors are absolutely the same for other chronic diseases. So we have to figure out a way to study these diseases together so we can figure out the net benefit, net risk across all diseases. And of course, there are lots of barriers to integrative prevention research. They're structural. We're all siloed, right? So I'm a prostate cancer researcher. Maybe I don't talk to breast cancer researchers, even though it's the same cohort. We're all subdivided. Same thing, I'm cancer. Joe's cardiovascular disease, he's down the street. Well, he's actually kidney disease, but he's down the street. And so we need to think about studying these diseases simultaneously together. So integrative prevention, so what's the concept? So you have a modifiable risk factor, high prevalence, that affects so many different outcomes. And together, these outcomes can lead to lack of well-being, premature mortality. If you can knock out the key risk factors for everything, you're just going to reduce chronic disease risk in general, and that would be a lovely thing, increase well-being, and people can lead long and productive lives. So integrative prevention is a way to go. Okay, current hot topics in cancer epi. Well, this means also where the money is. And so comparative effectiveness research on cancer prevention, control, treatment, patient outcomes, eliminating disparities, important areas, there is money available. Individualized health. Okay, that's like a buzz slogan, individualized health. Well, this is true for cancer prevention and treatment. Money is going in that direction, but gee, we may need new methods if we're studying an N of 1. That's going to be tough. Okay, global cancer, so important. So epithelial cancers that are common here are going to be common everywhere else. So we need to study them, of course. We don't need to restudy important findings that are going to be consistent across the board. Smoking and lung cancer, we know the answer there. NCI has great focus on global cancer now, so you can go to their website if you're interested in seeing what they're thinking about. They raise the point that we know a lot of risk factors, but in a setting where there might be resource limitations for screening and treatment, there'll be a whole other set of problems that cancer epidemiologists can help address. And then we can't forget, while we're thinking about global cancer, that we still have a problem here in the U.S. with profound cancer disparities. And so you can see ACS data, remarkable variation in cancer incidence and mortality rates. And so fortunately, we have a group in the cancer epi area of concentration, Jean Ford and Darcy Phelan and Alana Mittman, who are focused on cancer disparities. And then training. Training's so important. So we want to be able to nurture thinkers who can fully participate in multi, inter, and transdisciplinary cancer research that is focused on translation. And so in fact, we do this now. We do need to formalize it a bit more and better advertise it. And here's some of the trainees. I'm getting close to being done. So public health service obligations of cancer epidemiologists. Okay, we know how to prevent more than 50% of cancer. Okay, we know this. So we had a great speaker come a couple of weeks ago, Graham Colditz. And he outlined what some of the barriers are. So we have an obligation as cancer epidemiologists to make sure that we get the message out there, because I think the message got lost because we put too much information into the public domain that sounded contradictory. So our obligation is to counter myths, not to perpetuate the exposure the day approach to cancer epi. We should probably say no to press releases requests for minimal impact cancer epi studies. If it's not that important, maybe we shouldn't put it out there as a press release. And then we shouldn't obfuscate the more important known modifiable cancer risk factors. So I don't know if you saw this report. This was the President's Cancer Panel report released in April 2010. And so this report caused a lot of anxiety, I think, in the lay public, because it talked about chemicals as cancer carcinogens, risk factors. And the premise was, well, we haven't tested most chemicals that are out there to see if they're carcinogens, and so therefore we should be worried. And what it didn't say is, but by the way, we know some major risk factors for cancer that we should be intervening on, and we can study these things in the meantime, but let's intervene. So this caused a big stir, but it really sort of muddied the waters, I think. So cancer epi today and into the future. So we need to think about our research, our service, and our training, all moving toward translation, cancer prevention, and we need to do this now because there's a problem, but also we finally have momentum and we have buy-in. So here's Bert Vogelstein, one of our great colleagues across the street, colorectal cancer researcher. He now buys into the notion of prevention, right? He now writes about prevention, and so now we have his support. People want to think about this as a good area to go into for science. And also because of healthcare reform, we're going to have to prevent cancer. And so great area for people to train in. We need to ask important questions, and we need to ask them in the right way. So thank you.
Okay, our final speaker of the day is Buzz Stewart. Buzz was a 1983 PhD graduate in the program in environmental and occupational epi. He joined the faculty from 83 to 95. I had the pleasure to work with Buzz and Martha Lynette under Moises's direction in our, I think, groundbreaking studies of the epidemiology of migraine headache. He left Hopkins in 95? Yeah, and started a private firm, IMR, Innovative Medical Research. I do remember, which did clinical trials and survey research. He was bought out by Advanced PCS and stayed with them for a couple of years, and then went to the Geisinger Health System, where he's director for the Center for Health Research. And I learned right before that he's about to transition yet again next week, so I'll let him tell you about that. Buzz.
Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to be here, to see so many familiar faces. It feels like old home week. And I noticed that my time is up, so am I done? Or no? Let's see, where's the... That's it. So I am not going to talk about epidemiology specifically, but the role of research, of which epi is a very important part in healthcare. I've lived for the last decade in a healthcare delivery system where I started the research center that was very focused on thinking about how to deliver care better. And so I'm going to start, my topic is really the second revolution in healthcare, and perhaps it's musing, perhaps it's realistic, the future will tell. But I'm going to start by talking about the first revolution, and none of you were around during the beginning of the first revolution, but you're very much a part of an institution that launched it. And in the early days of the 19th century, and certainly in the early 20th century, medical education was a primitive form in this country, not so much in Germany, but it had many of the features sort of shown here. And science-based teaching really emerged in the late 19th century in Germany and was eventually imported to the U.S., but not until Flexner and his colleagues reviewed medical education in the U.S. And it led to a real transformation in thinking about how physicians should be trained here in the U.S. And of course, Hopkins was among a relatively few elite schools that were the model for the future, and really part of that profound transformation that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century. And that was the beginning of the revolution, and it was profound in terms of what happened. And so I'm just going to quickly go through a timeline of U.S. healthcare, because what followed was something that I would say no one anticipated. Physicians began to organize at the turn of the century. The early ideas of insurance started actually in the second decade. The early recognition of the cost of medical care began to emerge in the 20s. I think back to my days here when I was a student in the late 70s, where I thought, how much longer can this go on in terms of the cost of healthcare? Certainly we're at the end game. It turned out not to be true. The blues came into existence first with hospital insurance in the 30s, and then there was a rapid growth in insurance coverage, largely because of the role of employers in promoting it as a way to compete for workers. In the early 50s, there began to be thinking about the underserved. For those of you who grew up in the 60s, you probably recognize this picture and the introduction of Medicare and Medicaid, a profound transition really in the U.S. And then in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a real diversification of healthcare. We began to see consolidation of insurance companies that brought us to where we are today with relatively few insurance companies in the U.S. I don't know if you recognize this commercial from the Clinton era, the first effort at healthcare reform. And then, of course, in the 2000s, beginning to go overseas for healthcare because of the cost of it in the U.S. And the real change, I would say, in the beginning of what I think will be the revolution in the future is the introduction of information technology in healthcare that we're seeing in this decade. So many of you may be familiar with this picture. I think this picture is an extraordinary picture. The graph shows on the x-axis the GDP per capita in 174 different countries, and on the y-axis the healthcare expenditure per capita. And the slope of this curve is greater than 1, which says that as a country gets wealthier per capita, not only do we spend more on healthcare, but a greater and greater share of our GDP goes to healthcare. So you can guess where the U.S. data point is in this graph. And the question is, what's the end game? Is the end game that ultimately all of our GDP will go to healthcare? Or is this curve eventually likely to bend? And if it's likely to bend, how will it bend? This is an issue that I would say when you live as a research center and a delivery system, we wrestle with this every day because we wrestle with the cost of delivering care and trying to figure out how to do it better. The way in which the healthcare market is changing, I think, today is profound, and I think that it's going to accelerate. So we're seeing the digitization of healthcare records. I think it's a profound change in terms of not only how we will deliver care, but also how we will do research, how we will generate knowledge, and the pace at which we'll generate knowledge. We're also seeing a consolidation on the delivery side, I think, that parallels the consolidation that we saw on the insurance side, although not nearly as fast. And then the expectation is that healthcare systems will deliver more care for less cost. That is a pattern that we've seen over the last 2 decades and is likely to continue, but the question is how will that happen and how will digitization help in that way? So when you think of the trend and the changes that are unfolding in a very unique way on the delivery side, because it's really a fundamental transition in going from paper records to digital records, I ask myself, what's the role of research in this new model? But before I get into that, let me just talk about a brief timeline of U.S. biomedical research. And so the NIH emerged in the 30s, or its early precursor. The 70s and 80s are seen, I think, as the golden era in funding by NIH in terms of the profound and rapid growth and our ability to produce knowledge at a pace that exceeded our ability to sort of use it in healthcare, and the long delays that we began to see between knowing how to improve health and actually being able to use that knowledge in everyday care. We thought in the 80s and 90s that one solution was to codify knowledge, but we learned that even codifying it didn't really make it accessible. And one of the fundamental changes I think we're going to see in the next couple of decades is the codification of knowledge in a way that makes it readily usable, and almost the commoditization of knowledge so that all can use it. And I would say in the last decade what we've seen is a recognition that not only are we not using knowledge in real time, or the knowledge that we have effectively, but if you look at the proportion of decisions that are made in clinical practice, we recognize that about 2/3 are made without evidence. So our focus really has been in areas that perhaps don't address our needs. And in many ways, I think digitizing data on the delivery side will reveal to us where those gaps in knowledge are, and also how we can use those same data to accelerate addressing the gaps in knowledge. So I'm going to speak to the way in which we've organized research that grew out of early ideas of that Hopkins model, the Mayo model, the Harvard model, and where healthcare actually evolved in a way that we didn't anticipate. And so we have a huge concentration of knowledge in academic medical centers. Enormous. It's extraordinary. I think it exceeded our expectation. An ability to generate knowledge in a way that we never imagined. And then we have the delivery system and the payment system outside of those academic medical centers. We never envisioned that these two worlds would actually grow up separate from each other. And our current solution is to build a translational bridge between the academic medical centers and this enormous enterprise of healthcare delivery in the U.S. And I'm not sure if that translational bridge is a symptom of the first revolution or part of the solution. My bias is that it's a symptom and that we're trying to retrofit a research model to serve the needs of this enormous enterprise in a way that it cannot meet it. And I would say it just reflects my own experience in having lived in an academic center and then moved to build a research center that's part of a delivery system, and the way in which my thinking was transformed about how, not only how I should do research, but the questions that I should be trying to answer. And my intention is to draw this fabulous institution into that world, because this is an extraordinary place. And really, I think it's a question about the balance of research and the relationship between where research is heavily concentrated and how it should relate to where care is delivered. So we have the academic research model, and I'm going to talk about the research and development model. The research and development model, it turns out, outside of our world, is the oldest research model in existence. It exists in many different business sectors outside of healthcare, and it's an extraordinarily successful model that is inherently translation focused. And so when you think about our notions of translation, the translation model was invented a while ago in other business sectors. I want to introduce you to, if you're not familiar with this organization, the HMO Research Network. I happen to be the current chair of this network. It's an organization of 19 research centers that are part of large delivery systems in the U.S. And the number of large delivery systems that are creating their own research centers is growing rapidly. It will never parallel what we have in academic medical centers, but it is an important link, I think, for the areas that we have research capabilities concentrated. Now, those research centers vary in their relationship to their delivery system. If you look at the way in which the culture of the research center evolved and how the researchers behave and whether or not they care about their delivery system, it actually turns out that the model spans a broad spectrum from the left, where the research center is somewhat independent of the delivery system, and that's going to change, to the Geisinger model, which is shown on the right, which is really very much an R&D kind of model. And what we're seeing actually in the HMO Research Network is more and more of those research centers are being pulled into the orbit of the delivery system, because the delivery system feels it can no longer afford to have a research center that doesn't engage in the business that they're in. And so it's a natural transition for that to happen. So let me just go outside of healthcare and talk about how business markets typically behave. And I want you to think about that graph that I showed you, where as the GDP grows, a greater and greater share of the GDP goes to healthcare. It's an unsustainable model, obviously, and we're at the lead of that. But the way in which most business markets behave, all except healthcare, is that they expand and they innovate to survive. And they offer what I characterize as the better, faster, cheaper proposition. All right? Whatever it is we have today, you're going to get it faster tomorrow and at a lower cost. And that's very different from our proposition, right? Because our proposition is different, that we can deliver outcomes more expensively tomorrow than we do today. And we have lots of healthcare that we can provide, seemingly unending healthcare that we can provide you, as long as somebody is willing to pay for it. And what happens in most markets is that the share of the GDP that goes to that market shrinks over time. It does not expand over time, because there is a natural dynamic that makes it more and more efficient over time. And so the question is, when will that happen with healthcare? I thought it was going to happen in the 70s, naively, and then I thought, well, maybe it's the 80s, okay, it's the 90s, and here we are in 2012, and we don't seem to quite be there, but it certainly feels like we're there. And so in my role at Geisinger, when I think about what we should focus on, I think about creating value. And I borrow a lot from the ways in which other service businesses have thought about creating value and inventing solutions. And it naturally leads us to think about who are the stakeholders? Who do we have to think about when we create solutions that are translatable to practice? So we have to think about the patient, we have to think about the provider, we have to think about the payer, and the best solutions are ones that satisfy all of those needs. If we satisfy just one, it's not going to be a solution that ultimately will create value. And our model for translating ideas to practice really follows very much a traditional drug development model when we think about different ways in which we can go from knowledge that we have in the electronic health record to alpha testing solutions in a few clinics to system level scaling of those solutions where we prove that they actually work at a system level, and then taking them beyond our borders. It's a very, very structured and sequential approach. We even build infrastructure, I would say, in a way, and I think this is a key to sort of thinking about how we do research on a much larger scale, where we have partnerships with our clinics, where they're equipped to do research not only quickly, but where we can understand what's going on at each step in the process. And so we have some clinics where we've actually installed Omni microphones in the exam room, and where when the patient gives permission, we can automatically record the conversation between the patient and doctor. And why do we need to do that? Because in many encounters, it's the conversation that is a mediator of change. And if we can't measure the quality of the conversation, then we can't really understand whether or not we're influencing the thing that should mediate change. And so Deborah Roeder is a collaborator of ours on some of our projects where she's giving us feedback on the quality of those conversations. Now, you might ask, why would any doctor subject themselves to being recorded? It's all anonymous. And our deal with the clinic was that we would create a library of high quality and low quality conversations so that physicians could more rapidly learn how to have high quality conversations with their patients. Our view is not just about the clinic and the encounter and what happens in the encounter. We have a broader view of the community. This is one of many maps that Brian Schwartz, who comes out every other week to Geisinger, has created as he's used our electronic health record data to understand what is going on in the community. He's done that for abandoned mines and impact on chronic disease progression, for infectious diseases and other ways. And he's done some really extraordinary work there at a relatively low cost. So I'll just close with a few thoughts about how we think about accountability. Certainly we have the traditional metrics in mind that you have. We think about value creation and holding ourselves accountable, and a vision towards how we create a cumulative return on investment based on how much money we get from the system and how much we get from the outside. I think the future, in my mind, of research and the extraordinary capability that this institution and others like it have is taking our complementary strengths, ours on the delivery side and our deep knowledge of how healthcare is delivered, and our own data, which grows in value each day, and other kinds of infrastructure that we can create, and working collaboratively with an institution like this that has so many great strengths that I think are underutilized in really transforming care. And I think that when I think about the relationship and where we should go in the future, it's not a thin dotted line between our institution and the likes in academic medical centers, but a much stronger one that builds a collaboration where we transform care together. So I'll stop there.
Okay, I'd like to ask the panelists actually to come up. We don't have a lot of time. We've got about 15 minutes. I think, wow, we've heard a lot today. I believe this is being recorded, so when you have questions, there are microphones down front. I'll pick on our dean and ask him to handle the microphone, as you always seem to do. Thank you. Basically, there are a number of common themes that came through this talk, the series of talks. There's a strong focus on translation and translation to provide relevance for epidemiology. There were certainly a number of comments about the role of epi in new technology and sort of the good and the bad, big science versus mom and pop science, and implications of all this for the teaching of epidemiology. Elizabeth mentioned training. Bill mentioned training. So does anybody on the panel want to sort of jump in on an area where they really hadn't yet asked a question, posed an issue? Go ahead.
So I'll just make one additional comment, which is I talked about the cost of healthcare, but I also think it's important to think about the cost of research and how much it costs us to generate knowledge. And I think that we're also probably at a turning point in terms of expectations for how we do research more efficiently and how we generate more relevant knowledge at a much lower cost. And again, I would say that we're entering an era where we have unprecedented access to extraordinary volumes of longitudinal data through something like the HMO Research Network, where our ability to generate knowledge, I think, is going to be unparalleled. But we have extraordinary demand for new methods, I think, to learn how to use these data in a way that, that is credible.
Maybe a quick question to maybe Buzz in particular. I think it's dramatic how research moves with technology, and I think information technology is an amazing technology when you look at things like Google that didn't exist before. One of the things that strikes me is the concept of privacy and consent. Do you think our current IRBs are consistent with the kind of progress that when one looks at Google's, et cetera, as to what they do with information and what we're allowed to do with information?
It's a great question, and we've gone through struggles ourselves as we've done in practice trials, because I think this is an area where that issue gets raised in a very specific way. And what are the sensible rules of the game given bioethical considerations? So actually Ruth Faden and Nancy Cass and I have spent a lot of time talking about this and have some joint proposals together. I think we're going to be going through a transition, I think, because there's almost no way that we can migrate to true pragmatic trials where it's a seamless kind of process and truly integrated with delivery without moving beyond that. And I think that issues of harm and things of that sort are no greater than the way in which we deliver care today. It's just, a more structured process. So I think it's a really key issue that we have to hopefully move beyond.
So if I could just, Buzz, I'll just pick up on what you said. There's this assumption in your talk that we know what we need to know, right? And so you're looking to solve problems, right? And sometimes some of the most important work comes out of not being goal focused in terms of solving a problem, but looking at a question or puzzling, thinking about the evolution of a project, and not necessarily trying to do something more cheaply or find a more efficient way to do it. So I would, so it seems to me, yeah, you have been out in the delivery side for a long time. So you're thinking about healthcare delivery problems, but is that all that academic health centers should be doing?
Not at all. I mean, I only need about 10% of you, not 100%. I think it's a question of balance and where we spend our federal dollars. Clearly, the fact that we can't even use what we've generated is a symptom of a larger problem in terms of how we've structured and funded research. Do we want to abandon the search, the less guided search? Definitely not. We would lose our way, I think, having folks on the frontier. But there is so much to be done about making effective use of what we already know and learning how to do that well. There's so much to be done in taking the diverse knowledge that we have about human behavior and using it well in practice. That I think shifting some focus to that side is really warranted. I think the return on investment will be extraordinary. But I would also say that by looking at how we actually deliver care and knowing how few of the decisions are based on evidence, to me, is extraordinary in these times in terms of
the areas where we should be generating evidence.
A few moments ago, when David called the panel to the stage, he said something about what does all this mean for the teaching of epidemiology. I think in review of the last couple of comments and questions, what does all this mean for the education of care deliverers, physicians, and so on? Medical schools seem to be, or it seems to be the thing to do, to revise one's medical school curriculum these days. But how do you see how do all of you see what has been said to us, which I think is absolutely fascinating and so very important? How does that play into the education of medical students, for example, nurses and other caregivers?
Go ahead.
Maybe that's me. So I think a lot of it is about making sure that all those interested in understanding how to make a difference for human health, using epidemiologic approaches, using clinical and basic science approaches, make sure that everyone learns the language of each other's discipline. So to have exposure to all disciplines at a somewhat surface level, but not to, say, cut out epidemiology from medical school education because maybe that's not viewed as being the most valuable. So everyone has to have some exposure to multiple disciplines that'll ease our ability to communicate and do research together in the future. Yes, yes. So, for example,
not just research, but
so
deliver
yes,
care.
yeah. So to deliver care. So, for example, preventive strategies. So making sure that's on the radar. So that means we have to make sure that our primary care physicians in training understand the importance of, say, preventive strategies, making sure that they understand the evidence that went into developing those strategies. So I don't know. Why don't you give it a shot?
Yeah, so great question, Edith. I think that it's hard to know absolutely. I can just speak to what we're doing in reengineering care at Geisinger, and I think the implications that I think it has for training physicians, and it really comes from the leader of our primary care practice network. So, in real time, we're actually analyzing patient data in relation to codified guidelines and the displaying content for the patient and the doctor to see in real time. And the head of our primary care network would say that what this represents is a transition where physicians are gathering data during encounters based on what they know to knowing how to talk to patients about the data that they have in hand and the knowledge that's being displayed. So I think it has implications for perhaps more broadly understanding knowledge that you have in front of you, interpreting it in a way that makes sense to the patient, and trying to figure out what the best path is for them. It's a very different kind of paradigm, I think, than what we've had in the past.
So there are a number of comments, terrific, about the importance of translational research on the one hand, and then I heard people say, we already know a lot of stuff to do and we just don't do it. And there is a problem here. So I'd like to ask two questions. One is, what do you think is not, it is a big buzzword, we have to do more, what isn't being translated? I mean, we've tried translating a lot of things like obesity isn't good for you, but go and make an impact on that, as Elizabeth pointed out. Tobacco use, we did make a difference for all but 20% of the population, perhaps, but I think that had a very different cause. That was a second-hand smoke. I think so we stigmatized smokers more than convincing smokers that they shouldn't do it for their own good. So where do you see this translation on the one hand going? On the second hand, how do you think once you've translated and found something, you can actually make a difference, whether it's amongst the population at large, where it is behavior? And that's what we really, and I think Buzz brought that out. I mean, we don't know how to change people's behavior. And we make an environment which does everything against changing people's behavior. On the one hand, the other is, how do we change behaviors amongst those of us who know? I've heard repeatedly that the wonderful, 5-point checklist or 10-point checklist that Peter Pronovost has done, under very tightly controlled conditions, you can get physicians to do that with nurses overseeing them, but in most hospitals, you cannot change the physician behavior, and they simply don't work.
So is that
That was more of a statement, I guess.
But
I
Buzz will
welcome
respond.
commentary.
so? The changing behavior to me is the sort of next frontier. It's really extraordinarily complicated. I can just tell you, Al, how we think about the translation process, because we live in the clinics every day and we see the challenges, the organized chaos of primary care in particular, and how difficult it is to try to systematize anything. But I would say that our philosophy is that we have to design things to make the best care the easiest care to deliver. And when things fail, it's not because the patient or the physician failed. It's a failure of design. It's a failure of the way in which we've engineered things. It's a failure of the way in which we've gathered content and displayed it. And so I think that framework, I think the opening philosophy of how you think about your job to make change to me is really fundamentally important. I can't tell you the number of times where I've been at talks where folks have said that it's the doctors that aren't changing. We have to change behavior of both patients and doctors and other providers in the clinic. I think also that the two fundamental informatics changes that are going to unfold in the next decade are going to be very important. So one is access to data and knowing how to use it in real time. There's a strong epidemiologic component there. And the second is codifying knowledge at a level that makes it operational. That to me is going to be a really important and fundamental change that will fundamentally change how we can do things at the point of care.
Karen.
Yeah, my question may well be too large, but as I was listening to everyone talk, I would love to hear a few thoughts on what you see for the epidemiological design of the future. And I think, Buzz, you've spoken to it a little bit. Elizabeth, you've spoken to it a little bit. I'm coming from a point of view where much of my epidemiological engagement has been together with the epidemiology of aging. My colleagues talk about two things repeatedly. One is that in the current era, the cohort study will be much harder to fund and something else is needed, and then the discussion gets more fuzzy in terms of what will replace it. And the second is the greater integration of basic science as we look for physiological etiologies. And so just any thoughts as you've thought deeply about this, about major shifts you see coming in the paradigm for epidemiological studies going into the future?
Maybe I'll try this one. And I think translation is one aspect. I mean, once you have the methods, once you have the knowledge, you can try to translate that, try to change things in society. But another question is to acquire these methods and acquire this knowledge. And what I've tried to show in my brief presentation is that there is a process, of going for more and more refined methods in studying issues that are always more complex. And this is the role of academics. I mean, we have now issues like, and the other speakers also talk about these complex issues that we have to address. And behavioral issues are also complex, and clearly we don't have now the tools to do that. And I think the teaching and the role of academics is to keep, this leadership and try to identify new ways to solving these questions. And so that, because we know today that we cannot do much on, neurodegenerative disorders or metabolic. So how are we going to do it? And we're still with the model that is based on, external research and passive participants. I mean, is it going to be like that all the time? Are we going to go towards a model in which the participant, the patient, the population is much more active at all levels of the research? I mean, there is a whole lot of a world of new area that needs to be developed, and they are being developed, because since the criticism that 10, 15 years ago were addressed to epidemiology, that was risk factor epidemiology, that it was a failure, to investigate single factors. There's been a tremendous amount of research in EPN, and I think even if some of the concepts are recycled, like multi-level, and multidisciplinary and life course, they are becoming reality, and more they will help us to understand those new issues. So I think we should clearly separate, what's the role of academic in developing new research, new methods, new concepts, and addressing more complex issues, and the role of academics in contributing to translating this, what we know already, and changing the situation in society.
So I was struck very much by the discussion of type 3 error and this question of the difference between accumulating publications and actually contributing to moving the field forward that I think Drs. Moss and Platts talked about. And as someone who is shortly entering the job market, I feel like I see that in my colleagues who are desperately trying to publish in order to enter an incentive structure that rewards that. And I wondered whether any of you had any comments about whether there was low-hanging fruit in terms of changing the incentive structure that many of the professionals who work in this field operate in order to produce some of the change which you all have suggested is important.
So filling knowledge gaps is incredibly important still. We just have to make sure that the questions for which there are gaps are important questions that ultimately could lead to a difference. So there's nothing wrong with incremental research. We just have to make sure that that research is sort of framed within the larger scope of the problems of human health. So I'm just as guilty as everybody else of doing these little teeny tiny, is this associated with that, and this little tiny group. It is okay because it does advance knowledge a little bit, but always can sort of frame it within the scope of larger problems. And I think that'll help us feel better about ourselves, and at least we can put data together. Where's our Cochrane Center colleagues are here, is of course we can put data together in a meta-analytic way, so even small studies, small questions when put together can be very rich when combined. So don't be disheartened, although I do admit sometimes I go into a little bit of a funk when I think, oh, I'm barely moving my field along. But ultimately, usually something good happens, other people combine data together, and then a result becomes clear and there's consensus.
Okay, last question.
Thank you. I was interested in your comments, Dr. Stewart. As a clinician, I think we do know a lot of the issues that affect ischemic heart disease. I'm a cardiologist. But you talk about the patient, you talk about the physician, but I think you're missing one big area, and that's society. So it's the issues of where patients live, the factors that affect them, that I think that epidemiologists as well as clinicians need to actually be engaged in the political arena, in a much larger arena in this country, to see what we can do to change society and its influences on patients.
That's a professor of cardiology saying.
Right.
Not a plan.
Yeah. So I'm not sure I agree on one level. I certainly agree that bringing an understanding of an individual's environment and their context into managing their health and helping them manage their health makes complete sense. And in many ways, I would say we've over the last 5 years, certainly with Brian Schwartz, have thought a lot about how to map the data that we have and begin to think about using it ultimately in real time. I'm not convinced that the change will occur at a macro level, just as I was never convinced that payment reform was going to influence anything. When you look at how businesses transform, it happens at the place where all the action occurs. That's where the real revolution occurs. And I think that over the 20th century, we had no way of transforming the way that we delivered care. We didn't have the infrastructure to do it. I think digitizing makes a fundamental difference in so many ways. But it can't just be digitizing the data. We have to digitize the knowledge. That's where there's going to be another gap. That unless we digitize and anatomize knowledge at the level of the data, we can't really, I think, achieve a full revolution.
May I say something also on this? I mean, there is clearly the possibility for the scientists to influence society, but don't forget that it works mainly the other way around. Society influences the scientists a lot. And historically, when you look at the 17th century, 19th century, early 20th century, there are a situation of huge societal crisis which led to major development in epidemiology. And we're living such a situation now. And I think between the crisis that we live at the societal level, the new challenges in terms of health issues, I mean, that's probably a very fertile, a very fecund situation for scientists to move ahead. We're mostly product of the society rather than being able to influence that. If we can, I think it's important. But don't forget that we're also product of it.
Joe McLaughlin, who was in on the first summer program, gets the last question. I was wrong.
This is to Buzz Stewart. Dr. Stewart. I was very interested in your research and development model. I think you may be on something. But and you, one of your slides, you had something close to Moore's Law about getting, better, cheaper, faster. Now, that would be nice for healthcare, but with the greater and greater role of the government, I'm not aware of many institutions in the government that are, that get faster, cheaper, more efficient. So how do you factor that in?
Well, I guess I would say, Joe, it's great to see you, by the way. I haven't seen you, I think, in a couple decades, and I hear you're back. I think the government's dominant role right now is payment, right? And I would say that, in fact, the dominant role is the squeeze that's going to come from payment, and that the amount that providers are going to get paid is going to go down. And that's an enormous force function. And we're likely to see consolidation because of that. We're likely to see much deeper thinking about how we more efficiently deliver care. I think that there are huge risks that we face because if we don't think how to do it smartly, we'll deliver things more efficiently but with poorer quality. But I think that's the main force that I see. It's how much less will be spent for the same kinds of encounters that we've had in the past.
Let me suggest that we continue this over some food and refreshments. Thank you to the panelists.